Everyone, welcome back. Josh B. Taran, Alex Goldman here for From the Stands. And today we're very luckily joined by the former UFC heavyweight and the former UFC light heavyweight champion, the true legend, a man who is really a pioneer of mixed martial arts and a guy I grew up watching compete, the natural Randy Couture. Randy, thank you very much for the time today, man. It's a huge honor to get to sit down and chat with you, man. First things first, how have things been with you? I know you're in Saudi Arabia, so how have things been since you got back?
Man, amazing. An amazing journey. Obviously, a long trip for just a couple of days around there. A remarkable experience. I think in the 25 years I've been doing this, it was probably the best fight show I've ever sat and attended and watched. I think before that, it was probably a Pride in Satayama Super Arena. Some of the Pride shows were remarkable. The production value and everything they put into those. They welcomed us with open arms, and it was truly an amazing experience.
Awesome. Well, just on that, Randy, I just wanted to get your thoughts on Francis and Tyson Fury. Obviously, it was an amazing performance on Francis's end, and what he was able to accomplish last weekend is one of the greatest combat sports feats in history. I'm just wondering what your takeaway was from that event, and also, did you get a chance to speak with Francis after the fight?
I didn't get a chance to get close to Francis after the fight. It was just a madhouse, as you can imagine. But I was just very like I said, an amazing experience all the way around. Francis did a phenomenal job. I don't think anybody gave him a snowball's chance in hell even getting out of the first round, let alone going all 10 rounds. And by many people's estimations, won that split decision. It could have easily gone the other way. It was that close. I don't know what the one judge was looking at. The 96-93 score was a bit ridiculous, but the other two scores were what I watched. That was the fight I saw. It was very, very close, back and forth. I thought Francis took his foot off the gas a little bit in the 6th, 7th, and 8th round. You could tell his breathing changed. He may have got a little tired in that stretch, but came back strong in the 9th and 10th rounds. Obviously, the 3rd round knockdown was amazing. The entire place jumped to their feet, and it was nuts. So the production value was incredible. That stage, the sliding stage, the show, the pyro, the ring coming up from the ground on that stage. I mean,
Randy, I was wondering, how you view the fight game, how has it changed from when you were, a fighter and you were competing compared to now when, you have you can take more of a perspective, from the outside looking in. How do you view the fight game changed from when you were a fighter to now?
Well, I mean, it's gone through a couple of iterations. Obviously, when I started in 97, it was a completely different sport. We weren't using rounds yet. We were using a 10-point must system. It was a lot more of a fringe sport all the way around. My first fight, UFC 13, the sport's just gone through a lot of change since 97 when I started. We were considered criminals and somehow dangerous because we got in a cage and fought. Nobody really understood us. I think the landscape changed significantly. We ran towards regulation, went to rounds and a 10-point miss system and unified rules across the board. Eventually sanctioned in every single state in the U.S. Came back on pay-per-view where we lost our pay-per-view for a while. A lot of people thought the sport was going to die, and I think give credit where credit is due. Zuffa and company did a great job of rebranding and changing people's perception of what mixed martial arts was all about and who we were as fighters. And certainly the Ultimate Fighter and that first season of the Ultimate Fighter was a perfect vehicle in the reality genre to give everyone a bird's eye view of who we are and what it takes to be a fighter in this sport of mixed martial arts. So it's been interesting. I think we've gotten a little corporate now. The UFC's wearing uniforms, eliminated sponsorship opportunities from a lot of those athletes that fight, at least in that promotion. The sport has caught fire globally around the world. There are promotions everywhere now. There's a fighter standing on every street corner that, if one of the guys doesn't want to sign one of these crappy UFC contracts, there's another guy standing right there that's more than willing to give it a go. I think we need to, as fighters, unite and come together and recognize that we're the commodity and we deserve a fair, bigger piece of the pie of the revenue that's coming in our sport. I think the PFL is doing a great job of countering some of that and taking care of these fighters a little bit better. But the federal legislation that protects boxers, the Muhammad Ali Act, needs to be amended, needs to change to all combative sports athletes. These grapplers that are doing pay-per-views, there's a lot of facets to combative sports that are taking off in many ways. So they deserve that transparency and the protections of that federal legislation that has been protecting boxers since '96. And obviously the UFC is lobbying very, very hard to keep that from getting amended, to keep that from going to a vote, at least in our country. And in many other countries, it's largely unregulated. So it's up to the promoters to regulate it and do what's right. And obviously at the end of the day, it comes down to dollars and cents. It comes down to money. This is a business. So we need to find that middle ground. Show me another professional sport in our society where 13 to 15% of the revenue from any single event goes to the athletes that competed in that event. That is ridiculous.
Yeah.
And that needs to change.
Yeah. No, I wholeheartedly agree with you, Randy. And just, switching gears a little bit, I just asked this question to Kenny Florian, and I wanted to ask the same question to you, being a lot closer to Francis and the whole situation with the guys at Extreme Couture, your gym. Don Davis came out this week on Ariel's MMA Hour and sort of said that he thinks Francis will fight MMA next year, but maybe not next because with the opponents it's just not that interesting right now. It is a bit of a tricky situation because, and all credit to Francis, this is a wonderful time to be Francis Ngannou because of the opportunities he has now in the boxing realm and becoming a megastar and so in demand now. For you, I guess, who do you realistically think in an ideal world could actually challenge Francis in an MMA fight in the PFL and generate that interest from the MMA fans?
Well, we've got our championship final coming up here on the 24th of November. Dennis Goltsov and Renan Ferreira are two amazing heavyweights that a lot of people don't know that much about. And if they've been following any of the PFL, they've watched these guys. And sometimes they're on fire and you think, man, there is nobody going to touch either one of these dudes. And then sometimes they don't show up and you wonder what the heck's going on. Both of them are very formidable opponents. And I think given the right circumstances and the right opportunity, they're going to be tough for anybody to deal with, including Francis. 6'8" and as athletic as Renan Ferreira is, the experience of Dennis Goltsov, 7-time world champion in combat sports sambo. I mean, that's a ton of experience. So, but nobody knows their name yet. And I think obviously after the 24th, I think some folks are going to know their name. I think we're going to start attracting a lot of free agency. Obviously, I think the buying of Bellator is going to infuse the PFL with some pretty amazing names. Ryan Bader, is their heavyweight champ right now. He would be an amazing fight with his wrestling background and his skill set against Francis. He's certainly a marquee name in that organization. Maybe isn't as big as a John Jones or somebody like that, but he's still a huge name in the sport. And I think that is probably the goal with buying Bellator, is absorbing that roster. 250 fighters. At least 10 or 12 of those fighters are very, very big names like Cyborg, Chris Cyborg, the Tricky brothers. I mean, there's a bunch of very tough cats in that lineup at the top of that roster, and a whole bunch of those athletes in the lower and middle end of that roster that will be absorbed into these regional programs that the PFL is launching, like PFL Europe. Next year, I think PFL Australia is coming online. You're going to see East and North Africa or Africa come online as well next year, as well as this pay-per-view model. So, I think the sky's the limit there. This company just continues to explode. And in many ways, with this new format, with a unique approach to MMA and the care and voice that they're giving the fighters in the PFL, I think, we're on our way to taking over the sport in some ways.
Definitely. And, kind of talking about the PFL and, Bellator merger, if that, does completely go ahead, with no issues whatsoever, what are some matchups you'd like to see between, current Bellator fighters and current members of the PFL roster?
Well, I think immediately Kayla Harrison and Chris Cyborg.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a fight that's been in the making for a couple of years, and a lot of folks want to see that. I know that Kayla wants that Pacheco fight back for sure, and Pacheco's another one that is in that mix, on the cusp of potentially winning her second world title for the PFL in that division. So those three right there are going to make some very interesting pay-per-views
Yeah.
moving forward next year. Uh, you know, Ooh, I mean, there's this Clay Collard. Match him up with anybody. I'm going to
Mm.
tune in. That guy is fun to watch. His boxing is incredible. He's a very, very well-rounded mixed martial artist, but exciting as heck. The fight with OAM is going to be incredible. Who has their way in that?
Yep.
Sadabusi and Magomed Kirmov, in a rematch, and with the new skills that Sadabu's added, pair him up with anybody. I want to see how they do.
Mm.
Everybody's asking these questions. How do these guys pair up with some of the best fighters out there, with Bellator or the UFC? And there's the issue and the lack of transparency in our sport, and why some of these rules and federal legislation needs to be added so that it is a free and open market, and we as fighters can go wherever we need to go to make the fights happen that people want to see.
Mm.
And that's right now, the restrictive contracts and the nature of the sport, it's not possible. It's why the Fedor fight never happened, because
Yeah.
at our peak, that was the fight we both wanted, and the two organizations that kind of controlled us couldn't come to terms and couldn't make that happen. So there's definitely some growing room in the sport still, even as popular as it's become around the globe. They just sold out in Paris for PFL Europe, and the Dublin fight is coming for the finals there, and it's really, really amazing to see that be successful. You never know. I mean, you just don't know what's going to happen. I don't think we knew back then when they banned us from People's Choice, and we lost our pay-per-view carriers, and everybody thought the sport was going to die. And thankfully, Fertitta's had the savvy to rebrand and create a better image, put the right people forward to show that we are a legitimate sport and that we're real. And again, you have to give them kudos for the savvy that they had to do that. At the same time, they knew exactly what they were looking at.
Yeah.
When the federal legislation was passed in '96, Lorenzo Fertitta was the commissioner of the Nevada State Athletic Commission. So in 2000, 2001, when they're looking and doing their due diligence on buying the UFC brand from SEG, they knew exactly what they were looking at and
Yeah.
exactly how they could exploit and make the most of that opportunity. Spent $2 million in buying the brand, and 16 years later sold it for $4.4 billion. That's a hell of a business deal right there.
Yeah, 100%. It was pretty incredible, that sale that went through in 2016, and just on the PFL, Randy, I think this year has been. I truly think this year has been the most successful year in PFL's history, and I think it's sort of a things to come for the PFL. I truly think the PFL is on an upward trajectory of one that I think one day could rival the UFC, and I think he's currently rivaling the UFC, but rival them in a more dominant fashion, and heading into the PFL championships in 3 weeks' time. Just for you as a guy who's now an analyst and at most of these events, every few weeks, who has been a star for you that maybe a breakout star for 2023 that you didn't expect at the start of the year, but now you're looking at saying, wow, this guy or this girl is the real deal?
Well, obviously, we've seen Larissa Pacheco come into her own. If you've been following since her first season in the PFL, the physicality, the technical intensity that she's ramped up, to go and beat Kayla in last year's championship, and now in a position to win her second championship potentially. The other one that comes to mind is Jesus Pinedo. Here's a kid that came out of our Challenger series. Nobody knew who the heck this kid was. Everybody was enamored with Brendan Loughnane, myself included. An amazing personality, awesome fight tactics and technique. He gets out there, gets after it, and is fun to watch. And he comes out and lands that knee, and everybody's, oh my God, that was a fluke. No way, he can't repeat that. And he puts it on Bubba Jenkins, beats him like a redhead stepchild. I mean, I was floored, honestly floored. And puts himself in the championship final. So he has got to be the breakout star that everybody's scratching their head going, where the hell did this kid come from?
Yeah, for sure. Randy, there's a lot of changes and conversations around, drug testing in MMA, at the moment, from, the UFC sort of USADA split to, other organizations now sort of looking at how they're going to be doing drug testing moving forward. My question is, do you think drug testing is ultimately a good or bad thing for MMA? Because, I see the argument for both sides, which is if you're not testing and it's open, guys can recover quicker, they can train harder, you might see better fights. But, I see the other side, which is, these are people's health and, it's their lives that we're playing with here. Where do you sort of sit? Do you think drug testing is ultimately a good or bad thing for MMA?
Well, it's such an interesting question. And, obviously I was involved with Olympic wrestling for a huge part of my career and where I got my feet wet on the international stage, competing at that level. And certainly USADA and drug testing was a regular part of that and has been a regular part of that since the 1960 Olympics. That's when this whole thing started. That's when they started testing people. That's when the first people failed tests for using a performance-enhancing drug. In some ways, it's part of human nature. We're always looking for that shortcut. We're always looking for that leg up, that little advantage. And some guys are willing to do, anything to win, to get that, and including, put themselves at risk, both physically and in other ways. So I think it's unfortunately a necessary evil. It's this tit for tat. They come up with new testing, they come up with new drugs, and it just goes back and forth, and will probably never end, frankly. Obviously, they started testing in mixed martial arts in 2000. Right away, Josh Barnett was one of the first guys to fail. I was involved in that. I was his opponent in that fight.
Yeah.
And, from my perspective as an athlete, I never cared. And when new guys I was fighting were using, and it's very apparent, you don't make physical changes like some of these guys have made in that amount of time and do it naturally. It's not possible.
No.
I always looked at it as an advantage as an athlete. If they were worried about beach muscles and how they appeared, they were thinking about the wrong things. They were not focused on the tactics and technique it was going to take to beat me and to get me to quit or break me.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, in my mindset, in those situations, that was an advantage for me. I was going to be able to exploit that flaw in their thinking and in their approach to the sport. So it never bothered me, ever. And I was perfectly okay with testing as well, because, can't very well have a nickname like the Natural and then lose, pop positive in a test. And I 16 years on the national team, tested on a regular basis. Failure to show up for one of those tests was admission of guilt. They knocked on your door, were there for a sample. You better be ready to give them a sample. It was that simple. So I've been on both sides of it. I know how it works. I think the USADA thing was a little bit carried away, frankly. You had to let them know if you were going on vacation and where you were going on vacation. I mean, it was a bit invasive, in my opinion. And my issue with any of that is, where were the fighters' voices in how that regulatory body was brought in? The fighters deserve to have a voice in how they're regulated and how they're tested. And that has never happened. And the PFL is coming to close with their athletes advisory board and some of the stuff that they're doing to allowing us to have that voice in our regulation and how we're regulated. ABC is certainly embracing that in creating committees and bringing athletes in to voice how they feel we should regulate a lot of these things going forward. It's certainly interesting to me that the first time we really step up and do 3 shows in Las Vegas, we have 10 guys pop positive. That, in my mind, stunk. There was something going on there. And Dana's response to that was classic. Oh, I bet they don't come back to Vegas. I mean, that says it all. That says it all in my mind.
Yeah.
We've had 5 previous seasons and not one positive test. We have 3 shows in Vegas and 10 positive tests.
Yeah.
That's a bit crazy.
Yeah.
So I think, unfortunately, it's human nature. It's something we have to embrace. I hope that we as athletes have a voice in how we're regulated, and I don't think you should be allowed to put yourself in harm or your opponent in harm by chasing those shortcuts and using performance-enhancing drugs. It's not fair. We have to level the playing field, and we have to draw the line somewhere.
Yeah.
So definitely. That's an ongoing challenge, because the athletes get smarter and the testing gets smarter. It just goes back and forth, and so I think the PFL is talking about potentially bringing USADA in and starting to use them. I hope that they keep that reeled in, and it doesn't become as invasive as it was. It's difficult bringing an outside entity, and we saw this. I mean, why did Mark Hunt sue?
Yeah.
Because those test results weren't disclosed when they should have been disclosed in the Lesnar fight. Why would you sit on those results for 3 weeks and then disclose them after the fight was over? Because there's a lot of money riding on that main event.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, there's a problem in the system. If you're able to stifle results, why are you testing then? If you're just going to sit on the results till after the fight is over, that doesn't make sense. So there's definitely some issues there that need to be addressed. I'm all for testing. I think it's part of human nature for humans to look for those shortcuts, look for those ways around and those legs up. And so I think we have to find that middle ground. There has to be some compromise on both sides of that equation.
Yeah, definitely. Randy, last question from us today, man. Look, we got through the Wi-Fi troubles and we're here now, so we appreciate your time, man. we very, very much, man. Look, you mentioned it earlier, PFL Australia. We're proud Australians, and I think what the mixed martial arts scene here in Australia particularly has grown exponentially over the last 5 to 6, 7 years. You're seeing a lot of these athletes come to the UFC and really take over. And I think they could do the same in the PFL. And currently, there's girls like Chelsea Hackett, Rob Wilkinson, Shane Mitchell, who are in the PFL, and they've all done phenomenally. Obviously, Rob Wilkinson, a former PFL, light heavyweight champion. And I just want to know, you mentioned that it could be down the line PFL Australia. What do you know about this potential PFL Australia that could be, coming down the line?
Yeah, one of the PFLs in Las Vegas, we had six gentlemen from Australia come over, and a bunch of us had dinner with them after the show, and they discussed creating the connection with Channel 9 and some of the other infrastructure that they had in place to bring the PFL into Australia and launch PFL Australia, which obviously is one of the regions that we're very interested in. I've done some of my training in Australia, in Sydney during the Olympics with Larry Papadopoulos and John Donahue. John was one of the first black belts that would ever work with me and Dan Henderson and Matt Linland as wrestlers, finding black belts in jiu-jitsu that would train with us because it was a very closed system back then. John was one of those few guys that, Jean-Jacques Machado had a black belt there. Gene LaBelle was a long-time black belt with Gene LaBelle, who were guys I had a lot of respect for. And he was willing to embrace the heat, if you will, and step in and train with us. He runs a great program there in Melbourne. Obviously, Boxing Works in Sydney with Larry. I did train for one of my camps during the Olympics there at Larry's place, and then went from there up to Japan, much closer to fly from Australia to Japan for one of the Shuto matches that I fought in Japan. And great gyms, great facilities, doing great things to promote. John put on that NHB show in Melbourne. Put me on the footy show my first night in country. I was like, I could not believe. I was there for 9 days, and everywhere I went after that first night, oh man, I saw you on the footy show. Like, who the hell? Everybody in the country watches this show.
Yeah, it was a big show.
Amazing. But I'm excited because there's a bunch, Elvis Sinisek, certainly one of the first Australians that I met that was fighting at a very high level, fought in the title fight with Tito Ortiz back in the day. There's a lot of great athletes, a rich heritage in striking sports in Australia for sure. And now I see the grappling and the wrestling coming up and really shoring up. And that's the trifecta for mixed martial arts. So I'm not surprised to see a lot of success from a lot of athletes in Australia. And I'm excited to get back to Australia. It's been a while. So
yeah, definitely. We'd love to have you.
I'm looking forward to seeing a PFL launch there and really seeing that region take off and give them another professional outlet for mixed martial arts.
Definitely. Well, Randy, thank you so much for joining us this morning, man. I know for Josh and myself, it's a true privilege and an honor for us to be able to talk to someone, who is an icon of the sport and, really helped push the sport to the next level. And, especially thank you for bearing with us through the technical difficulties with Wi-Fi today, man. But it's been a true honor to talk to you, and we'd love to talk to you again in future, Randy.
Well, I appreciate you guys for having me on, man. I really do. I hope everything goes well. Get that edit done with all our glitches and our issues. But I'm happy to be on. I appreciate you guys very much. Thank you, guys.
Thank you,
Awesome.
Randy.
Thank you very much, Randy.